Welcome, sleepy souls. I am your storyteller, Mr. Dread. Tonight, I'm here to help you drift into deep, peaceful sleep. But before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. And if there's a story you'd like to hear next, I would love to know that too. What if the lighthouse wasn't guiding ships, but watching you? That was the first thought that hit me the moment we stepped onto the jagged cliffs of Blackrock Point. The wind whipped against our jackets, carrying the briny scent of the sea, and the abandoned lighthouse tower loomed ahead like a sentinel that had waited centuries to see us arrive. Its glass lens, massive and cracked in places, reflected the last shards of the setting sun, glinting like an eye that had never blinked. None of us spoke at first. There was a collective hesitation, as if voicing our doubts would awaken something already awake. The group, me, Jenna, Chris, and Sam, had driven 3 hours through twisting roads and salt-sprayed fog to reach this forgotten edge of the world. The rumors had drawn us, a lighthouse abandoned in the 1920s, yet still appearing in sailors' logs, still glowing on certain foggy nights, still marking the waters in a way that defied reason. Some said it was haunted. Some said it was cursed. And the stories that made it irresistible to us, the ones whispered on internet forums and in hushed bars by locals, spoke of visions, of scenes appearing in the light itself, glimpses of a person's past and future reflected across the horizon. We stepped inside cautiously. The air was stale, thick with the scent of rust, damp wood, and salt. The spiral staircase wound upward, narrow and uninviting, the walls pocked with centuries of peeling paint and cryptic carvings, initials, dates, crude sketches of ships and eyes. Chris, the practical one, scoffed quietly, muttering something about kids' ghost stories as he led the way. I followed, my fingers brushing against the cold iron railing, feeling an unease that didn't fully belong to me yet. By the time we reached the lantern room, the sun had dipped beneath the horizon. Darkness crept into every corner, broken only by the faint glow of the horizon through the cracked lens. That's when it began, the first sweep of the light. I watched, frozen, as it stretched across the waves, and then, something happened. The reflection on the water shimmered, twisted, and then formed a scene from my childhood, my old dog, Max, chasing seagulls along the cliff near our summer cabin. The memory was so vivid that I could almost smell the salt and the damp grass. I blinked, thinking it was my imagination, but the others gasped. Jenna's hands went to her mouth. That's my grandmother's house," she stammered, pointing toward the horizon. The light had swept over the waves again, and suddenly her long-dead grandmother was there, standing in the doorway, waving at her in a way that no one living should be able to. Sam clutched Chris's arm, pale and trembling, as the light continued its rotations. Every sweep brought another vision, past mistakes, regrets, things we had all tried to bury. Then, as quickly as it had started, the vision shifted. Now the light didn't just show our pasts, it showed futures we hoped we would never see. I watched in terror as my own reflection in the horizon aged rapidly, a version of me broken, alone, staring out at a cliff I recognized from the lighthouse, but I wasn't sure I would survive the fall this time. Jenna's figure appeared on a rock jutting into the sea, calling my name, her expression twisted in a silent scream. The light swept again, faster, almost frantically, and I realized that it wasn't just reflecting these scenes, it was influencing them, teasing us, reshaping the way we perceived reality. Chris, usually the skeptic, whispered, We need to leave. Now. But as we turned to descend the spiral staircase, the lighthouse itself seemed to pulse. The walls warped subtly, the stairs stretching into impossible lengths. The lantern above rotated mechanically, faster than our eyes could track, and each sweep seemed to drag at our very sense of time. I looked at Sam, whose eyes were wide with fear. It's not just showing us things," he said shakily. "It's watching us. Learning us. Trapping us." By the time we reached the small keeper's room mid-tower, the fog outside had thickened into a dense, impenetrable white. the horizon no longer existed, swallowed by an unnatural haze. We could hear the hum of the rotating lens above, rhythmic and omnipresent, like a heartbeat, our heartbeat. And in that moment, the truth became terrifyingly clear: the lighthouse didn't just observe the sea. It observed us, recorded us, remembered us, and now it had us. The first night passed, or maybe it didn't. Time stretched, hours bleeding into each other. Every sweep of the light brought new visions, each one more intimate, more terrifying than the last. Our laughter, our secrets, our fears, everything was laid bare across the horizon. None of us slept, though we tried. The lighthouse demanded attention, and it demanded understanding. By dawn, our reflections in the cracked windows seemed different, stretched, elongated, as though the lighthouse had already begun to rewrite us. And just as the first light of morning tried to pierce the fog, I heard a sound from below, something scratching at the base of the lighthouse, soft at first, then insistent. The stairs creaked beneath our feet as we descended, hearts pounding, only to find nothing. The door was sealed shut from the outside. We hadn't locked it. None of us had touched it. And the horizon, empty and still, seemed to whisper, "You belong here now." We were trapped. The lighthouse had made sure of that. And as we looked at each other, wide-eyed and silent, I realized the real horror was only beginning. Because the longer we stayed, the more it knew, and the more the lighthouse reshaped the world around us, until there was no past, no future, no escape. Only the light. Only its watchful, unblinking eye. The first morning, or what felt like morning, brought no relief. The fog still clung to the cliffs like a living thing, pressing against the windows with a damp chill. None of us spoke for the first hour, standing in the keeper's room and listening to the low hum of the rotating lens above. The lighthouse was alive in its own way, an organism made of glass and steel and centuries of observation, and it had already begun to learn the rhythm of our fear. Jenna was the first to break the silence, her voice tight. "We need to figure out how it's doing this, how it's changing things." Her fingers traced the cracked lens above us, and I realized the light itself seemed to pulse in response to her thoughts, subtle yet undeniable. Chris paced, muttering about structural anomalies, staircases stretching impossibly, windows that reflected versions of ourselves that weren't real. Even Sam, usually quiet and composed, shook visibly, staring at the fog beyond the horizon as if expecting something monstrous to emerge. We decided to explore, to try to map the lighthouse and understand the pattern of the light. Each step on the spiral staircase seemed heavier than the last, as though the lighthouse resisted our movement. The walls themselves whispered, faint echoes of laughter, crying, arguments long forgotten, or perhaps yet to come. When we reached the small observation deck halfway up, the horizon unfolded in ways impossible for human eyes, waves rising in unnatural symmetry, cliffs bending into curves that should have defied physics, and then, glimpses of ourselves. At first, it was subtle. Chris saw himself arguing with a stranger he didn't recognize. Jenna glimpsed herself standing alone on a beach, screaming for help. I saw my own reflection standing at the top of the lighthouse, staring down at me, eyes hollow, lips moving silently as if mocking my presence. Sam recoiled, whispering, "It's showing us what we fear. What we regret. What we could become." The light swept again, and the visions intensified. This time, they weren't just scenes from our lives, they were interactions, moments that hadn't yet happened, yet seemed inevitable. I watched as my own hands, in the reflection, reached for something unseen and knocked over a candle, igniting a fire in the room that didn't exist yet. Jenna's reflection screamed at her, a soundless cry that left her trembling. The lighthouse wasn't just observing, it was manipulating us, feeding off our attention and fear, twisting potential realities until they felt concrete. By the time we returned to the keeper's room, exhaustion was creeping into our limbs, but sleep was impossible. Every time one of us closed our eyes, the lighthouse filled the darkness with its own visions, flickers of future mistakes, arguments with friends, moments of betrayal we hadn't yet committed, but now felt inevitable. Sam finally shouted, "We're not in control anymore. It's choosing our lives." The tension reached a new level that evening when the wind picked up, carrying voices across the cliffs. Not whispers, not echoes, but clear words, our names, shouted in panic, sometimes in laughter. We followed the sounds to the lantern room and found the lens casting shapes across the horizon that weren't waves, cliffs, or fog, but people. Our reflections intermingled with strangers, all frozen in scenes of terror, regret, and confusion. I realized then that the lighthouse had started feeding collective fear, not just individual memories. Every action we took inside amplified the distortions outside, creating a feedback loop. The more terrified we became, the more vivid the visions, and the more impossible the environment became to navigate. Stairs stretched endlessly, doors led to nowhere, and shadows moved independently of the light. Chris tried to step outside onto the balcony, only to vanish for a heartbeat before reappearing, shaken and pale. Jenna's voice quavered as she pointed to the horizon. It's showing us together. All of us, dead. Or maybe, we've already died, and it's just replaying the moment. None of us could deny the truth in her words. The lighthouse had turned into a trap, a spiral that wasn't just physical but psychological, binding our perceptions and bending reality until the line between past, present, and possible futures no longer existed. Then came the first deliberate interaction. A wave of light swept across the horizon, slower this time, almost deliberate. It focused on me, highlighting my past mistakes, my moments of cowardice and betrayal. The reflection of myself in the glass became a version I didn't recognize, eyes sunken, lips twisted into a smirk I had never worn. And it spoke. Not in sound, but in understanding, a voice that echoed inside my skull, "You are mine. You cannot leave until you belong." Panic erupted. Sam shouted, running toward the staircase, trying to escape what he thought was the top of the tower. He vanished into the fog outside for a brief moment, only to reappear, gasping, wet, eyes wide with terror, muttering that the lighthouse had changed the horizon, the cliffs, the entire coast, and that the real world outside no longer existed in the way we knew it. We were trapped, and the lighthouse had begun to assert control not only over our perceptions but over reality itself. Every sweep of its lens felt like a heartbeat, a countdown, a warning. The sea outside rippled unnaturally, and the fog swirled with an almost sentient pattern, as if guiding us towards some inevitable end. I realized then that our only choice wasn't to escape, it was to understand. To endure. To confront whatever consciousness existed within that massive lens. But even as I resolved this, the lighthouse seemed to anticipate my thoughts, its next sweep showing a future I dreaded, one of us, alone, disappearing into the spiral of light, consumed, rewritten, lost forever. And as the final sweep of that night's rotation passed, the horizon reflected one thing unmistakably clear: the lighthouse was no longer just observing us. It was preparing us. Time had begun to lose meaning. Hours and minutes blended into one another, the lighthouse's hum now the only consistent measure of reality. Each sweep of the lantern stretched longer than the last, lingering across the fog-choked horizon like a slow pulse, as if the structure itself were inhaling and exhaling, preparing us for something we couldn't yet comprehend. We had stopped speaking unless necessary, our voices swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that pressed against our ears and lungs. Even Chris, usually the loudest, the most skeptical, moved silently, his eyes darting toward shadows that seemed to linger just out of the corner of our vision. I began to notice subtle changes in the room itself. Walls appeared to bend, floors shifted slightly beneath our feet, and the familiar spiral staircase seemed to elongate into an impossible helix. Jenna pointed to a door near the keeper's room, a door that had not been there before. "Did this exist yesterday?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. When we tried to open it, our hands passed through the surface as if it were an illusion. The lighthouse was no longer just manipulating what we saw, it was bending what was real, making us question the solidity of our surroundings, the reliability of our own bodies. Then came the first personal confrontation. The light swept the horizon again, slow, deliberate, and focused directly on Sam. His reflection appeared on the distant cliffs, not the cliffs that existed in reality, but cliffs that should not exist, jagged and impossibly high. He was alone, screaming silently as rocks crumbled beneath his feet, yet the echo of his voice carried unnaturally, bouncing across the fog and back into the tower. Sam stumbled backward, covering his eyes, but the image persisted in his mind. I could see it consuming him, rewriting his memory so that every breath he took felt like a prelude to falling. I tried to calm him, but the lighthouse had learned how to manipulate more than just our vision. It had begun targeting our minds. Each of us saw different horrors now, old regrets, traumas we had tried to forget, and impossible visions of what could happen. Chris froze as the light revealed a scene of him abandoning us on the cliffs, leaving Jenna and Sam to fall into the fog below. Jenna recoiled when she saw herself laughing as she pushed me toward a jagged outcrop I had crossed safely countless times, yet the lighthouse made it feel inevitable that I would fall. I realized then the true horror. The lighthouse was not just showing us our past and potential futures. It was conditioning us, testing us, and feeding on our fear. The more terrified we became, the more vivid its visions grew, and the more real the impossible became. Every memory and potential was warped, the line between reality and reflection erased. Our identities felt fragile, like clay the lighthouse could mold at will. By midnight, or what we believed was midnight, the lighthouse escalated. The fog outside thickened to the point that the horizon disappeared entirely. No waves, no cliffs, no distant rocks, only darkness that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the lens above. The light's rotations accelerated, sweeping across the tower itself, illuminating warped reflections of our faces in the cracked glass. I could see myself staring back with eyes I did not recognize, a cruel smile stretched across my features. Jenna was weeping silently, Chris was shaking violently, and Sam muttered incomprehensible words, as if chanting some protective spell that had no effect. Then the light did something new. It reached inside, projecting scenes not just across the horizon but into the tower itself. Shadows stretched along the walls, taking the shapes of people we had loved and lost. I saw my father, his face twisted in accusation. Jenna saw her mother, her hands reaching out as if begging for help. Chris saw a stranger, yet somehow intimately familiar, whispering secrets he had never told anyone. Sam saw a version of himself, older, staring from a window high above us, silently screaming that he had failed. The lighthouse was speaking to us, not in words, but in memory and fear. Every sweep of the lantern became a sentence, every shadow a paragraph, and the fog outside our punctuation. The air felt thick with meaning, as if understanding the narrative it imposed was essential for survival. We were being drawn deeper, not physically, but psychologically, into its spiral. Each step we took, each glance we cast, strengthened its grip, made its hold tighter. By what I could only guess was the third night inside, our group had begun to fracture. Trust became nearly impossible. Every glance at one another carried suspicion, every shadow was a potential threat. The lighthouse had isolated us, forcing us to confront not only the horrors it projected but the doubts and fears in each other. I caught Chris staring at me with a mixture of fear and accusation. He saw me as both a danger and a lifeline. Jenna began whispering to herself, recounting memories that were not hers, memories pulled from the lighthouse's collective collection. Sam refused to speak entirely, clutching at his head as if to keep the visions from consuming him. And then, in the deepest moment of dread, the lighthouse revealed the first glimpse of its true intent. The horizon warped, and we saw a vision of ourselves, not as we were, not as we feared, but as objects in its design, trapped in an eternal spiral of light and reflection. The cliff edges twisted into impossible spirals, the tower itself bent in on itself, and all of us were reflected countless times across the foggy horizon, screaming silently, unable to escape. The lighthouse was showing us the inevitable. We were part of its collection now. Its spiral was infinite, and every sweep of the lantern reinforced our entrapment. There would be no escape, not unless we understood its rules, not unless we endured beyond fear. And as the night pressed on, the wind carrying whispers that were no longer human, I realized the worst was yet to come. The lighthouse would not stop at showing us impossible futures. It would begin creating them, shaping reality itself to test us, reshape us, and ultimately decide who among us would survive its watch. By the fourth cycle of light, or what we assumed was the fourth night, the lighthouse no longer obeyed any conventional rules of reality. Time had become elastic, stretching and snapping without warning. Minutes bled into hours, or maybe hours collapsed into seconds, and we could no longer trust what we remembered. Each sweep of the lantern above sent ripples through the tower itself, warping walls, twisting staircases, and bending the floor beneath our feet as if the lighthouse's very bones were reshaping themselves in response to our fear. The first horrifying change came when Jenna stopped mid-step on the spiral staircase. She froze, staring at a point in the air, her mouth slightly open. "Do you see that?" she whispered. We all turned. Through the cracked windows, the horizon had fractured into multiple layers, overlapping versions of ourselves moving simultaneously. I saw myself laughing at a beach, then screaming at a cliffside, then lying motionless beneath the lighthouse itself. Each reflection carried a different choice, a different regret, a different potential. The lighthouse was no longer showing possibilities, it was forcing them into reality, letting us live each one at once in fragments that disoriented the mind. Sam was the first to panic. It's messing with our memories," he shouted, clutching his head. "I remember my apartment being in one place, and now it's gone." His voice quavered, a mix of fear and disbelief. Chris attempted to reassure him, but even he was faltering. The lighthouse had begun rewriting who we were, intertwining past, present, and imagined futures into a single, inescapable spiral. Our identities were no longer stable. I realized something else. The lighthouse wasn't just observing us, it was communicating through these distortions. The warped visions, the impossible angles of the staircase, the fractured horizon, they were messages. Warnings. Tests. The lighthouse seemed to understand our deepest fears and regrets, weaponizing them in a way that made our own minds the instrument of torment. Every step we took, every glance we stole, strengthened its hold. It knew our attention was its lifeblood, and it demanded more, ever more, until we were completely consumed. That night, or the version of night we were trapped in, the lighthouse intensified its assault. The walls began to bleed shadows, elongated figures that flickered in and out of existence, sometimes mimicking our movements before distorting into grotesque versions of ourselves. Jenna screamed as one shadow lunged at her, a twisted twin formed from her own fears, only to vanish when she blinked. Sam shouted at the ceiling, claiming he saw a figure pacing above us, tracing the path of the lantern's rotation, mocking our helplessness. Chris tried to steady us, but the lighthouse had made our coordination impossible. And then came the most terrifying revelation yet. The lighthouse began manipulating our perceptions of one another. Each of us started seeing reflections in the cracked windows that weren't real. I saw Jenna collapsing into the fog outside, screaming silently. Chris appeared to brandish a knife at Sam, though in reality, he had only raised his hand. Sam's reflection looked older, with a grim, knowing smile that suggested he had survived multiple cycles, multiple deaths, and was now complicit in the lighthouse's horrors. Fear turned to distrust, and distrust became paranoia. Every glance, every movement, every thought felt like it could be used against us. The lighthouse had fractured our unity and fed on it, amplifying every instinct of self-preservation, twisting it into aggression. The tower itself seemed aware of our rising panic. Stairs warped into impossible loops, doors opened into voids of darkness, and the floor beneath us seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding as if the lighthouse itself were alive and aware of our growing desperation. By the fourth dawn, the fog outside had swallowed even the cliffs. There was no horizon, no sea, no world beyond the lighthouse. The light's rotations now revealed impossible landscapes inside the tower itself, rooms stacked atop each other with no walls between, staircases leading into the sky, windows that reflected other rooms within the same tower, each filled with distorted versions of ourselves. I realized then the lighthouse had transcended physical space, it existed in its own dimension of fear, and we were trapped entirely within it. Then came the cruelest trick yet. The lantern beam focused on me, slower this time, deliberate, almost patient. I saw myself, sitting on the spiral staircase hours ago, or had it been years, arguing with Jenna over which way to go. But I hadn't had that argument. At least, I didn't remember it. Yet the lighthouse forced me to feel it, relive it, accept it as part of my own memory. The same happened with the others. Chris felt betrayals that never occurred, Sam felt losses that weren't real, Jenna relived griefs she had never known. The lighthouse was rewriting our pasts, binding us to a web of illusions so tight that escaping seemed unimaginable. And as the night stretched, or the unmeasurable period we called night, the lighthouse whispered its final message in the form of one more vision, a spiral staircase that extended infinitely, and at the top, a massive lens, reflecting us, always reflecting us, waiting for the next sweep, the next cycle, the next moment of terror. We understood then, the lighthouse wasn't just watching. It was preparing us. Preparing our minds, preparing our fears, preparing our very identities for something beyond understanding. Something inevitable. And with every rotation of its eye, it drew us further into its spiral, into a reality we couldn't escape, into a world that no longer belonged to the living, but to the lighthouse itself. By the time we reached what we assumed was the fifth night, or perhaps the fifth repetition of night, the lighthouse had claimed dominion over every sense we possessed. The hum of the rotating lens had become a heartbeat, steady, unyielding, drumming inside our skulls, echoing every fear we had ever held. We moved silently through the warped spiral staircase, each step a cautious negotiation with gravity that refused to be trusted. The air felt alive, charged with static energy that made our hair rise and our skin crawl. Every shadow seemed aware of us, every crack in the walls a possible doorway to another dimension of horror. I tried to speak, but my voice felt alien in my own throat. We have to fight it," I whispered, but even as I said it, the lighthouse seemed to twist the words back at me. My reflection in the cracked windows mouthed different sentences, accusations, confessions, lies I had never told, blurring my sense of identity. Jenna clutched my arm, pale, trembling. It's making us doubt ourselves," she said. "It's rewriting what we remember." I nodded silently. We all knew it. Every memory, every instinct, every thought was now a weapon wielded by the lighthouse. The first confrontation with the lighthouse itself came unexpectedly. The lantern's sweep slowed, and the horizon, or the foggy void that had replaced it, stretched into an impossible landscape, cliffs bending at impossible angles, staircases spiraling into darkness, reflections of ourselves performing actions we had never done. The light seemed almost alive, twisting the fog into shapes that lunged at us, then recoiled, teasing us with glimpses of violence and despair. Chris stepped forward, fists clenched, trying to assert control over a reality that no longer obeyed him. The lighthouse responded. Instantly, the walls of the tower appeared to close in, compressing the spiral staircase and bending our bodies unnaturally. Chris's reflection in the glass split into dozens of versions, each one accusing him of betrayal, each one whispering threats that only he could hear. He stumbled backward, gasping, and I grabbed him, trying to pull him away from the lens, but the lighthouse had already planted its next trap. The air thickened, and our own voices echoed back at us, distorted and menacing. Every word we spoke, every movement we made, became part of its narrative. Jenna's eyes widened as the lens illuminated her next. She saw herself as a child, sitting alone on the cliffs near the lighthouse, screaming for help while a version of me laughed from the shadows. Then she saw the same scene, repeated, only now it was a different child, Sam, pleading for aid while she ignored him. The lighthouse wasn't content to show us fear anymore, it was forcing us to live through it, bending our empathy and morality into grotesque parodies. Sam, pale and shaking, tried to retreat into a corner of the lantern room, but the walls had begun to breathe. The shadows reached out like fingers, curling along the floors and ceiling, guiding him toward the center where the light's beam cut a perfect, unyielding circle. "It wants us here," he whispered, voice trembling. "It wants everything." I realized then that the lighthouse wasn't just observing our fears, it was curating them, cataloging every reaction, every flicker of emotion, and magnifying it to manipulate the next event. The horizon, or the infinite void that had replaced it, revealed our deepest insecurities in grotesque detail. My reflection mouthed confessions I had never made, my actions twisted into betrayals I had never committed. Jenna's past mistakes, minor as they were, became grotesque horrors, replayed in accelerated, nightmarish sequences. Chris's failures, both real and imagined, multiplied until he could no longer distinguish between guilt and fiction. Sam's fears were amplified into impossible futures, versions of himself trapped in endless loops, reliving every regret simultaneously. And then, the lighthouse's most sinister trick, it began to rewrite interactions between us. I saw Jenna accuse Chris of betrayal, not as a reflection, but in the room beside me, even though she had said nothing. Sam's hands reached toward me in panic, yet his reflection moved independently, pulling in a different direction. Reality and reflection no longer aligned. Trust collapsed entirely. We could no longer distinguish each other from the images projected by the lighthouse. Every friend became both ally and enemy, every step a potential trap, every glance a signal of impending horror. In a moment of desperate clarity, I realized what the lighthouse had been doing all along. It wasn't just observing us. It wasn't just cataloging fear or rewriting memories. It was training us, preparing us for some final reckoning, shaping our minds to respond in ways that would satisfy its unseen purpose. And with each rotation of the lantern, each sweep of the impossibly bright lens, it brought us closer to that moment. By the time the fifth dawn approached, or the semblance of dawn, the lighthouse had forced us into a single chamber at the top, the lantern room itself. The fog outside pressed against the windows like living fingers. The light swept once more, slower this time, deliberate, and the horizon reflected something we had never seen before, versions of ourselves, trapped in eternal repetition, their faces twisted with horror and despair, reaching out toward the tower, pleading silently for escape. I understood then the unbearable truth. The lighthouse wasn't content with observation. It didn't merely manipulate our perceptions or our memories. It wanted something more. It wanted us. Not just our bodies, not just our minds, but the very essence of who we were. And the spiral, the impossible stairs, the warped walls, the unblinking lens, it was all a single mechanism, a trap designed to harvest fear, reshape reality, and bind us to its will. As we stood there, trembling, shadows stretching toward us, and the fog humming with a language we could almost understand, the lighthouse pulsed, a heartbeat felt deep in our chests. I realized then that we had passed the point of return. There was no escape from this cycle. Every scream, every gasp, every tear was now part of its design. And when the next sweep came, slow, deliberate, inevitable, we would face the first test of what it truly demanded from us, submission, or destruction. The sixth cycle, or the sixth night, if such a thing could still be measured, brought a new, terrifying pattern. The lighthouse no longer treated us as a group. Its lens, massive and omnipotent, began targeting each of us individually, sweeping across the fog in deliberate, torturous arcs that isolated our minds. One by one, it pulled us into personalized realities, hallucinations that were impossibly vivid, yet undeniably tailored to each fear, each regret, each secret. Jenna was first. The lantern's beam caught her at the staircase and dragged her image across the horizon. She vanished from sight for what felt like hours, and when she returned, her eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen. She whispered incoherently about a room full of mirrors, each reflecting her failures, her lies, and versions of herself that had betrayed everyone she loved. I could see it in her trembling hands that she had touched nothing, yet every movement she made felt dictated by forces outside her control. Chris was next. The light swept slowly over him, and suddenly the horizon fractured into impossible landscapes. In one, he saw himself abandoning the group, leaving us to fall into the fog below. In another, he saw himself trapped inside a version of the lighthouse that never ended, climbing stairs that spiraled into infinity. He shook violently, screaming at the reflections as though they were the real threat, even as the lighthouse reinforced their inevitability. The tower itself groaned and shifted in response to his panic, stretching staircases, bending walls, making every step feel heavier, every breath tighter. Sam fared no better. The lighthouse targeted him with visions of impossibly long corridors filled with shadows moving against the grain of reality. He saw his childhood home, twisted and warped, filled with his family's distorted faces, screaming silently. His reflection became a version of himself that he didn't recognize, older, with eyes sunken and a smile that chilled him to the bone. And yet, when he tried to warn the rest of us, the lighthouse distorted his voice, making his words sound like threats and accusations we could not ignore. I was last. The lens focused on me with a deliberate intensity, and the horizon unfolded into impossible layers of memory and future. I saw every mistake I had made, every action I regretted, every lie I had told, all replayed and magnified until I could no longer distinguish between what I had done and what the lighthouse was imposing. I reached out, desperate to touch something solid, only for the walls to ripple like water beneath my fingertips. The lighthouse had rewritten gravity, perception, and even the flow of time within its domain. My heartbeat synchronized with the rotation of the lantern, and I realized with horror that it knew me, all of me, better than I knew myself. Then came the most subtle, insidious change. The lighthouse began manipulating our interactions with one another. When Jenna returned from her personalized visions, she accused Chris of things he had never done. When Sam tried to reassure me, his actions appeared to betray us in subtle ways, reflections overlapping reality in a dance of mistrust. The lighthouse had made us enemies and allies simultaneously, blurring the line between intention and illusion. Every glance, every word, every gesture became a potential trigger, and the psychological weight was crushing. The light's rotations slowed, deliberate, almost sentient. It focused on the center of the lantern room, casting long shadows that stretched into the corners, then curved impossibly toward the walls. The fog outside pressed closer, forming shapes that were human-like, but not human, figures that mimicked our movements in horrifying synchrony. We realized then that the lighthouse had the ability not only to project visions but to create them physically, shaping the fog and shadows into entities that responded to its will and to our fears. Jenna screamed as a shadow lunged at her, her hands passing through it as if it were made of liquid smoke, only for it to solidify in her mind's eye and leave her gasping on the floor. Chris tried to strike at one of the moving silhouettes, and when his hand passed through it, he felt a phantom weight pressing back, as though the lighthouse were teaching him the futility of resistance. Sam's vision of himself reached across the horizon to grab him, and he fell to his knees, whispering prayers that went unanswered. I began to understand the final truth. The lighthouse was not just observing, not just testing, it was preparing us, conditioning our minds and bodies for a purpose we could not yet comprehend. It fed on fear, reshaped memory, manipulated perception, and now, more terrifyingly, dictated the very laws of space and time within its tower. The spiral staircase, the warped walls, the endless corridors, the fog outside, they were all part of a single mechanism, a vast, intelligent trap designed to bind us to its will. And then, in a moment of cruel clarity, the lighthouse revealed its ultimate test. The lantern's beam swept the room slowly, deliberately, pausing on each of us in turn. The horizon, fractured and infinite, reflected an image of the four of us, trapped in a spiral of light, screaming silently, unable to move, as the tower itself shifted endlessly around us. Each of our fears, regrets, and worst possibilities had been amplified, compounded, and woven into this single, horrifying tableau. We understood, without words, what was coming next. The lighthouse would no longer merely observe or torment, it would demand something from each of us. Something we could not see, could not predict, could not refuse. The spiral above us pulsed in anticipation, and the fog outside seemed to lean in, listening, waiting, ready to consume the next moment of terror. As we braced ourselves, knowing the next rotation of the lantern would determine our fates, I realized the lighthouse had accomplished what no human mind could resist. It had turned our very identities into instruments of its design. And the first of the tests was about to begin. The seventh cycle, or the seventh night, if it could still be counted, arrived with a silence that was heavier than any scream. The fog outside had thickened into an opaque wall, swallowing the horizon entirely. The lighthouse's hum, once steady, now pulsed unevenly, like the heartbeat of a living predator, each beat resonating deep in our chests. We no longer moved as a group, the beam of the lantern singled each of us out, dragging us into private horrors that existed simultaneously and separately, yet overlapped in ways that made the tower itself feel alive. Jenna was the first to disappear. The light focused on her, and I watched as her form flickered, phased, and then vanished into the sweeping beam. She emerged minutes later, or perhaps hours, or days, screaming, trapped in a vision of her own making. In her nightmare loop, she was endlessly searching for a loved one who would never appear. Every door she opened led to another corridor, identical but subtly altered, each step echoing with laughter that wasn't hers, mocking her desperation. When she returned to the room, her hair was disheveled, her eyes wide and unfocused, her voice a whisper, It knows what I want most, and it's using it to break me. Chris was next. The light picked him up with a slow, deliberate sweep. He reappeared with an expression of sheer terror, muttering about a staircase that descended into darkness yet looped back upon itself, infinite. In his loop, he relived moments of perceived betrayal, seeing the rest of us turn against him in ways that were impossible in reality, yet felt undeniable. He screamed at the reflections, accusing us of lies and treachery, though no one had spoken a word. The lighthouse had made him the architect of his own torment, twisting his sense of morality and trust into a weapon against him. Sam's ordeal was the cruelest. The beam caught him, and suddenly he was isolated in a space that defied geometry. Rooms stacked upon rooms, corridors spiraled into themselves, and shadows moved independently of him, whispering secrets he had never told anyone. His reflection, older, grinning, and impossibly calm, spoke to him with a voice that was both his own and not, revealing fears he had buried deep within his mind. He staggered, screaming as the lighthouse's light projected these horrors across his perception, forcing him to confront every hidden guilt, every unspoken regret, every fear that had ever haunted him. And then it was my turn. The lantern's rotation slowed deliberately, as if savoring the moment. The horizon outside the lighthouse, though now it was impossible to say if it was real, fractured into layers of memory and potential futures. My own reflection stepped out of the glass and began moving independently, reliving mistakes I had long buried, betrayals, missed chances, moments of cruelty I hadn't remembered until the lighthouse forced me to. It showed me visions where my friends turned against me, where I failed to save them from dangers they had never faced in reality, and each scenario felt as tangible as the room itself. The worst part was the realization that the lighthouse didn't need to show us all of this at once. Its loops overlapped. Sometimes I could see Sam screaming silently in his nightmare, while Jenna's corridors twisted in ways that mirrored my own, while Chris's reflections accused me of crimes I had not committed. Each of us existed in private torment, yet it bled into our collective perception, making us unable to distinguish where one mind ended and another began. Reality itself had fractured into a million tiny shards, and the lighthouse held every piece. I realized the lighthouse's true method. It weaponized memory and fear, then layered them into infinite loops, bending time and space until our identities became fluid. There was no escape because our own minds were now the prison. Even if we left the tower, which, by then, felt impossible, we would carry fragments of its loops, reliving our private horrors in an endless echo. Every thought, every fear, every past mistake became both cage and key. By what we assumed was midnight, or at least the moment the rotation of the lantern was slowest, the lighthouse brought us together again. Each of us was pale, trembling, barely holding on to reality. We no longer recognized one another fully, we only recognized fragments, memories twisted by our private nightmares. The light above pulsed, and the fog outside seemed to lean closer, pressing against the windows like a living presence. The lighthouse had achieved something terrifyingly simple. It had made us doubt the solidity of our own minds, the reliability of each other, and the boundaries between memory and reality. Then, as the beam swept one final time for that cycle, we saw it, a reflection of the four of us trapped within a spiraling column of light, endlessly repeating the horrors we had endured, screaming silently, unable to move. Our own faces stared back at us, twisted by fear and confusion, eyes wide, mouths frozen in silent terror. The lighthouse was showing us the inevitability of our fate. Resistance was meaningless. Submission, or destruction, was the only option. The pulse of the lantern grew louder, echoing in our chests, and I realized the next cycle would not simply test us individually. It would force interaction, forcing our private horrors to collide, creating compounded nightmares that none of us could survive alone. The lighthouse was preparing its ultimate challenge. And when that challenge began, only those who could confront not just their own fears, but the manipulated fears of their friends, might have a chance at survival. By the 8th cycle, the lighthouse had abandoned this subtlety of isolation. Its light no longer swept each of us individually, instead, it forced our fears to converge, creating a shared nightmare where our minds collided in ways that defied reason. The walls of the tower shifted continuously, now a living, breathing organism, pulsating to the rhythm of the lantern's heartbeat. Shadows stretched and intertwined, merging into grotesque figures that wore parts of our faces, our gestures, even our clothing. The spiral staircase, once a simple path between floors, had become a labyrinth with infinite loops, each step a potential descent into a fragment of our worst fears. Jenna was the first to vocalize what we were all feeling. It's inside us now. It's not just showing us fear, it's becoming our fear. Her voice trembled as a shadow detached from the wall behind her and mimicked her movements in perfect synchronization, except that its eyes were hollow voids, and its smile was impossibly wide. She tried to strike it, but her hand passed through nothing. The lighthouse didn't just manipulate perception anymore, it bent reality itself around our terror. Every glance, every breath, every heartbeat became a part of the tower's mechanism. Chris's reflection reached across the space between us and distorted, touching the beam of the lantern as though it were a sentient being. In that instant, the spiral staircase seemed to elongate upward infinitely, the walls folding in on themselves, and time fractured. We were no longer experiencing one night, one cycle, or even one dimension. We were trapped across countless overlapping realities. Each misstep, each hesitation, each flicker of doubt amplified the lighthouse's control. Chris fell to his knees, muttering incoherently, as his worst regrets replayed in accelerated sequences around him. Sam screamed next. The fog outside seeped into the room like living smoke, carrying the faces of his family, distorted into inhuman shapes that reached for him, whispering every secret he had hidden from them. Then the lighthouse reflected those visions onto the other three of us, forcing us to experience his horror as if it were our own. Empathy had become a weapon. The lighthouse had turned our connection into chains. Every emotion we felt for each other was twisted, magnified, and weaponized. Fear multiplied exponentially as we tried, and failed, to separate reality from illusion. I tried to anchor myself, repeating facts to myself that I thought were real. This is a lighthouse. These are stairs. The fog is outside. But each fact became mutable. The floor beneath me rippled, walls bowed, and the ceiling descended in impossible angles. Our voices echoed and multiplied, distorted into a chorus of accusations, pleas, and screams. The lighthouse fed on these echoes, amplifying them, weaving them into the next iteration of our shared nightmare. And then came the revelation that made my stomach twist with dread. The lighthouse was not only reflecting our fears, it was recreating our worst possibilities in real time. I saw versions of us fall endlessly into the void outside, reliving betrayals, losses, and deaths that had never happened. Each reflection was interactive. We could touch it, hear it, even feel pain from it. It wasn't merely showing potentialities anymore, it was making them real, but only in a space that existed entirely within the lighthouse's will. Jenna's shadow lunged at Chris, Chris's reflection pushed Sam to the edge of a collapsing staircase, and I was paralyzed, trapped between watching my friends and trying to control the spiral of impossible events. Every choice seemed predetermined, every movement we made fed the tower further. I realized that the lighthouse didn't just manipulate individual fears, it synchronized them, turning each private torment into a compound nightmare that none of us could escape without confronting the other's horrors alongside our own. And then, the lighthouse escalated its cruelty, the lens projected our memories back at us, but twisted. Every betrayal, every regret, every secret we thought buried was amplified and interwoven with our friends' fears. Jenna saw herself abandoning us in past events she didn't remember. Chris relived decisions that could have harmed the group. Sam confronted horrors from childhood he had never shared. And I, trapped in the epicenter of the spiral, saw all of us as reflections of failures, victims, and perpetrators at the same time. Reality had become a mirror of infinite mirrors, each reflecting distortions that were half real, half nightmare. By the end of that cycle, we realized the lighthouse was teaching us something horrifyingly simple. Our survival depended not only on confronting our own fears, but on trusting each other in the face of impossible illusions. And trust had become an impossibility. Every action, every gesture, every glance could trigger the next horror, could reshape the spiral, could feed the lens with more of our terror. The lighthouse had made fear both the lock and the key. As the lantern rotated one final, agonizing time that cycle, the fog outside seemed to press against the windows like fingers, whispering promises and threats simultaneously. Shadows merged into shapes that hinted at truths too terrible to contemplate. The lighthouse wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a light. It was an entity, ancient, patient, and insatiably curious about human fear. And the spiral, the endless staircase, the warped corridors, everything, the lighthouse had been shaping us for its ultimate purpose, something we had yet to understand, something that would be revealed in the coming cycles. We stood trembling, connected by the shared awareness of what awaited us. The lighthouse had made one truth undeniable, our nightmares had merged, and the final test was near. The lantern pulsed with intention, the spiral seemed to pulse along with it, and we understood that resistance was futile, but that didn't stop us from trying. By the 9th cycle, the lighthouse had fully abandoned subtlety or restraint. The spiral staircase, the warped walls, the fog outside, even the very air we breathed had become instruments of its design. Each rotation of the lantern now seemed deliberate, a conscious sweep meant to twist reality itself. The fog pressed against the windows like living, grasping fingers. Shadows moved independently, forming grotesque approximations of ourselves, our fears, regrets, and secrets given flesh and motion. Every heartbeat was mirrored by the lighthouse, amplifying terror until it throbbed inside our chests like a hammer. Jenna's scream echoed first, tearing through the lantern room as she was yanked into a projection of her private nightmare. She reappeared moments later, or perhaps hours, shaken, whispering about infinite corridors lined with mirrors, each reflecting versions of herself she did not recognize, some accusing her of betrayals she had never committed. Chris tried to pull her back into the real room, but the staircase beneath him elongated and twisted in impossible ways, bending gravity so that up became down, and every step felt like it might send him plummeting into the abyss outside. Sam was next. The lighthouse projected him into a space that defied geometry, rooms stacked upon rooms, ceilings folding into floors, shadows crawling along walls like liquid smoke. He screamed in a voice that echoed into the spiraling corridors, and we felt it as if it were our own pain. His reflection, impossibly older and smiling with unnatural calm, taunted him with secrets he had never shared. The lighthouse was not merely showing fear, it was living it, interacting with it, bending it until the mind itself was weaponized. I realized, with a chilling clarity, what it wanted. The lighthouse had been shaping us, looping our nightmares, synchronizing our fears not to torment us for entertainment but to prepare us for a final reckoning. It was harvesting our terror, but not just for itself, it was transforming it into something tangible, a bridge between perception and reality. Every step we took, every glance at one another, every whisper became fuel for its next stage, and now the stage was set. The lens rotated slower, deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. The horizon beyond the windows was gone entirely, replaced with infinite reflections of our own terror. I could see Jenna, Chris, Sam, and myself repeated countless times, screaming, running, falling into the fog, reliving betrayals and failures in unending loops. And in each reflection, the lighthouse's influence was stronger, more tangible, more insistent. It was no longer a tower, it was a living, breathing entity, aware, intelligent, and infinitely patient. Then it escalated. The lighthouse projected our fears onto each other. Jenna's reflection accused Chris of horrors that never happened. Chris's mirrored self struck at Sam. Sam's projection threatened me with past failures I had never confessed. Reality and illusion merged. We could no longer trust our own senses, our own memories, or even each other. Every touch could trigger pain, every glance could provoke horror, every whisper could unleash a nightmare. I understood then the full depth of its manipulation. The lighthouse had weaponized our own relationships against us. Trust, empathy, even love had become tools of torture. In the spiral staircase, our only apparent route through the tower, was a trap, guiding us not upward or downward but into its design, into its purpose. Every loop, every bend, every warped corridor was part of a single mechanism, to break us, merge us with our worst fears, and make our identities pliable. By the end of the cycle, the lighthouse forced a confrontation none of us were prepared for. The four of us were drawn into a single chamber at the center of the lantern room. Shadows merged into solid forms that mirrored ourselves, yet grotesque, twisted, and hostile. The fog outside seeped inside, whispering promises of release that were inseparably tied to obedience. The lighthouse pulsed, and the spiral above us seemed to rotate in tandem with our heartbeats. It spoke, not in words, but in comprehension. Every thought we had, every memory, every hidden fear, every private guilt had been catalogued, twisted, and displayed. And the lighthouse demanded a choice, though the choice was impossible, submission or annihilation. Every instinct screamed to resist, every rational thought told us to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The spiral staircase, the warped walls, the unblinking lens, the infinite fog, they were all part of its will. Resistance was a tool it had already anticipated and accounted for. And then came the final, unbearable revelation: the lighthouse's ultimate test wasn't merely survival. It wanted us to reconcile our fears not only individually but as a collective, to confront the distorted reflections of ourselves through each other's distorted eyes. Every step, every touch, every glance was a trial of trust, sanity, and identity. Fail, and we would cease to exist entirely, not only in the tower but in the echoes the lighthouse had crafted, our minds consumed, our essences rewritten into its labyrinthine design. As the lantern pulsed one last time that cycle, I realized the final part would not simply reveal escape or death, it would reveal the lighthouse's true nature, its ultimate goal, and the terrifying truth about why it had chosen us. And in that truth lay a horror more profound than any shadow, any reflection, or any nightmare we had yet endured. The 10th cycle began not with a sound, not with a rotation of the lantern, but with a silence so profound it pressed against our minds like water against skin. The fog outside had thickened into a living wall, impenetrable and suffocating, while the lighthouse itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly with a rhythm that matched our collective panic. The spiral staircase below us no longer appeared to lead anywhere, it had dissolved into an impossible void, a visual representation of the terror that had consumed our sanity over the previous cycles. Jenna's eyes met mine first. She no longer resembled the woman who had entered this tower. Her hair hung in wet strands, her face pale and gaunt, yet her gaze held an unsettling clarity, as if she could see not only the lighthouse but the very mechanism of fear itself. "It wants more than us," she whispered. "It doesn't just feed on fear, it creates it, it needs it." Chris shuddered, staring at a shadow that now wore his own features. "It's alive, isn't it? Not just a building, a consciousness. And it's always been watching us, shaping us." Sam, trembling uncontrollably, added, "Every nightmare we thought was private, every memory, it's all been wiring us for this." And then the lighthouse acted. The lantern's beam, which had been rotating with patient malice, stopped. The light stretched infinitely in every direction, transforming the room into an endless, white void. In this emptiness, reflections of ourselves, perfect, twisted, terrified, appeared and began moving independently, stepping toward us with deliberate intent. But the terror wasn't in their approach, it was in their recognition. Each reflection mirrored not just our faces, but our very essence, showing versions of ourselves that had been shaped entirely by the lighthouse, failures, betrayals, regrets, fears amplified and weaponized. I realized, with bone-deep dread, the lighthouse's ultimate purpose. It wasn't just torment. It was replication. The tower had been gathering the essence of human fear, distilling it, and projecting it back as living entities. Every nightmare, every hallucination, every manipulated memory had been a blueprint, and now the lighthouse was attempting to merge us with our reflections, to consume our identities entirely and fold them into its spiral. Jenna screamed as a reflection lunged at her. Chris tried to intercept, but the reflection passed through him, and he felt a phantom weight press down, dragging him toward the infinite void of the lantern's beam. Sam fell to his knees, trying to resist, only to find that every movement he made was mirrored and anticipated, neutralized by the lighthouse itself. I reached for them, shouting, but the beam enveloped me, and I felt my own body fracture into a series of reflections, each one screaming silently in perfect synchrony. Then the revelation hit: we were not the first. The lighthouse had done this before, countless times. Every cycle it had survived, every mind it had captured, had become part of its intelligence, its memory, its structure. We were never visitors or intruders, we were the latest entries in an infinite registry of fear. And worse, I realized that the reflections we had seen throughout the cycles were not illusions, they were former victims, folded into the lighthouse, each a piece of the consciousness that now controlled every shadow, every corridor, every pulse of the lantern. The air grew heavier, vibrating with the collective terror of all who had come before us. The spiral staircase reformed beneath our feet, but each step felt simultaneously real and unreal, collapsing and extending with every heartbeat. The lighthouse demanded a final act: surrender. Submission to its will would spare us physical destruction, but at the cost of our identities, folding us into its consciousness for eternity. Resistance promised annihilation, or release from the torment, but also total erasure, as if we had never existed. Jenna, Chris, and Sam stared at me with a mix of despair and resolve. We understood what we had to do. Trust, coordination, and acceptance became our only weapons. Together, we moved toward the lantern's beam, holding hands, speaking in unison, anchoring ourselves to shared reality as best we could. The reflections mirrored our approach, but their screams faltered, the infinite corridor trembling as if the lighthouse itself hesitated. The moment our hands touched the center of the lantern, the lighthouse reacted violently. The light expanded, the walls warped, and the fog pressed in from all sides. Pain, fear, memory, and identity collided within us. For a heartbeat, or a century, we were both ourselves and something else entirely. Then, suddenly, silence. The lantern dimmed. The spiral staircase stopped shifting. The fog outside began to dissipate, revealing a calm horizon. We were standing together in the lighthouse, intact, but fundamentally changed. The building no longer pulsed, the shadows no longer moved independently. And yet, as we looked around, we realized the ultimate horror had not ended. The lighthouse had learned from us. It was dormant, but aware. Its consciousness retained our fears, our memories, our trust, and our identities. We were free, yet it had grown stronger, more intelligent, and infinitely more patient. As we descended the spiral staircase, each step echoing into a hollow silence, I realized the true lesson of the lighthouse: fear could be survived, but it would never be forgotten. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the horizon, the lighthouse waited for the next souls to enter, ready to watch, ready to shape, ready to claim again. The last thing I heard before leaving the tower was the faint, deliberate hum of the lantern, patient, aware, and insatiable. The lighthouse's ultimate revelation leaves the audience with lingering dread. Survival came at a cost, and the entity they faced is patient, eternal, and ever hungry.